Let's talk about the 4-8-3 method,
Yes.
which involves 4 patterns, 8 elements, and 3 dynamics. And I would imagine this is a place where we want to spend a little bit of time to really get to a deeper understanding of all 3 of those things, the 4, the 8, and the 3.
Yes.
So let's start with the 4.
Well, so the first thing to understand is, the theory that all of this stuff comes from is called DSRP, just mostly because I couldn't think of a name for it. And it's just naming the 4 patterns. D, distinctions. S, systems. R, relationships. And P, perspectives. So that's the 4 part. The problem was that over time, because it was named DSRP, because there were these 4 things, people just thought, oh, there's 4 things. And they sort of almost just treated them like buckets. Like, I have a thought. Is it a D or an S or an R or a P? And so it was very important to get people to go a little bit deeper than the 4, because the 4 are actually based on 8 things. Each pattern, D, S, R, P, are the patterns of thinking. Each pattern is made up of 2 elements.
Oh, great. Okay. So
Right.
let's take it slow.
Yeah.
So let's just talk about the first pattern, which
Yeah.
is distinctions.
Yep.
And why don't we talk about just that and its 2 elements before we...
Yeah, so the distinction pattern is made up, like you said, it's made up of 2 elements. And those 2 elements are identity and other, right? So you can think of that as being like part of the distinction, that the idea of distinction is actually equal to identity and other. And it's the interaction between identity and other, right?
Right.
So identity is simply getting at the thing. So if I say, my gym or my watch or
Maybe something simple like a dog or an apple.
Or an apple,
Yeah.
or whatever this thing is that we put a word to oftentimes, that's the identity. The word that we use is representative of the identity.
Right.
So we say we're making distinctions all the time, and we are, but the thing that's visible or audible is the word that we use that represents this identity, like dog. And when we say that identity, there's this often invisible thing, which is the other or the not thing, right? Mm-hmm. So when we say dog, we're making an invisible line between dog and not dog. And that is the distinction. It's that line in between there that is the distinction.
Okay, so let's just take that a minute. So I'm thinking about something and I'm thinking about a dog.
Yeah.
And so the identity of what I'm thinking about is dog. And then there's a bunch of other stuff that is not the dog. So
Yeah.
literally the dog, the other to my dog could be a cat and a gerbil and a duck,
Yeah.
right? So other animals that are not a dog.
Yes.
But it sounds like what you're also saying is everything else that's not a dog is the other, like a hamburger is not a dog. Or
You can say, this is dog in the center. And yes, a hamburger maybe is out here, and that's definitely not a dog. And a cat is out here on this circle, and that's not a dog. So hamburger is way out here on this circle, and that's not a dog, right? And this is cat. And then, but then we start getting closer to dog, right? So then we get to, wolf. A wolf. Is a wolf a dog? Is a coyote a dog? Right? Is a fox a dog? Well, those are getting kind of closer to the boundary of dog. So yes, this is all dog. And all of this is the other.
I see.
But as we get closer to dog is how we really start to define dog, right? Mm-hmm. So if I said to you, if I put some cheese on a tortilla, is that a pizza?
No.
Okay, what if I put some tomato sauce on a tortilla? Is that a pizza? With some cheese.
Maybe.
And then if I put, at some point, something crosses the line
Yeah.
to become a pizza, like what your mental model of a pizza is, right?
Yeah.
And that line is often very kind of gray. It's not as black and white as we think it is, because one little change will be like, oh yeah, that's a pizza. Like suddenly it went from being a tortilla with cheese to a pizza somehow, or
in theory, yes.
In theory, right?
Yes. So just to sort of bring this home a little bit. So we can use, obviously, example of a dog and everything that's not the dog is the other. But it seems like what you said at the beginning, we should probably say a little bit more about, which is we often don't see the other.
Yes.
Right? So that probably matters in things like we had a whole controversy around defining torture.
Yes.
What is that's an important distinction. And what you're saying is we need to make sure that we're sort of not only distinguishing those things, but also paying attention to, say, we're talking to a group of people, right? And, we don't want to marginalize and not see other people who could be at the table, right? So if we identify a committee, the question is, well, who's everybody that's not
on the committee, right?
Right.
Yes.
Is that what you mean?
Yeah, and so there's othering. We sometimes call it othering or otherizing.
Yeah.
Othering can happen by mistake. We just don't think of the other. But it can also happen on purpose for manipulative reasons. So we otherize people to manipulate, or politically, or all kinds of reasons why we would otherize purposefully. But a lot of times we're otherizing just by the way that we're brought up, or the way that we think about a particular thing, and we don't think about the other. So what the distinction pattern is trying to get us to do is, whenever we have an identity, which is all the time, we have, if you think about a bunch of text, every one of those words is an identity, and even the letters are identities and things like that. So we're coming up with identities all the time. But on the most important ones, on the ones that really matter, we want to distinguish and challenge those identities to challenge what they are and what they're not.
Great.
And so the interaction between identity and other is what makes a distinction. So you can't have a distinction without these two elements.
And so, so that's distinctions.
That's
So distinctions, two elements, identity, and other. Now we're going to move to systems. Right?
Yeah.
So what are the elements to that?
So a lot of the things we just said about distinctions are true about systems, right? So systems is just the container for these two elements, which are part and whole. And in order for a system to exist, you have to have a relationship between part and whole, right? Mm-hmm. So there's always going to be a part, and there's always going to be a whole whenever you have a system. So if I mention a part but I don't mention the whole, we know that the whole is there.
I see.
If I mention a whole but don't mention the part, we know that the part is there.
Right.
Right? So these things always go together, just like identity other. If I mention an identity, there definitely is another. If I mention a part, there's definitely a whole. If I mention a whole, there's definitely a part. And the other cool thing is that every part can be a whole and every whole can be a part.
Right.
Just like every other is its own identity and every identity is an other.
Right. And I think the best example of that is us and them.
Yeah.
Like I can say, we're us and you're them, but when you're looking at me, you're us and I'm them.
Exactly.
Right. And let's go back to the part whole. So just use dog. A dog is a thing.
A whole dog.
A whole thing with
your pet named Bruno is a whole.
And then, but Bruno has parts.
Bruno has parts, and Bruno is a whole that has those parts. But Bruno is part of our family. Bruno is part of the dog species. Bruno's part of his breed. Bruno's part of lots of different systems, right? So Bruno is simultaneously a part and a whole. He's also simultaneously an identity and an other. He's somebody else's other. He's our dog, but to somebody else, he's an other dog.
Yeah,
not their dog. Right.
Makes sense. Okay, so that's good. So let's talk about
Bruno's a great example for DSRP. We'll have to put a picture of Bruno up.
We love Bruno so much. Okay, so let's talk about relationships.
So relationships, again, similar in the structure, which is that the pattern is a container for the elements. So I'm hoping what people are getting out of this is that the patterns are nice because it can help you remember DSRP is pretty easy to remember. But really where the real action is at the element level. And these are the elements, right?
Okay.
So relationship also has two elements. And those two elements are action, reaction. Action, reaction. So what that's saying is that anytime we have a relationship, what we're really saying is there's some action and there's some reaction. And like identity other and like part whole, the reaction can also be an action and the action can be a reaction, right? So these things are interchangeable, these two parts. But no matter what, if you have a relationship, you have an action reaction. No matter what, if you have a system, you have part whole. No matter what, if you have a distinction, you have identity other.
Okay, so let's give a quick example of action reaction because that might be a little bit fuzzy. So let's just use this dynamic right here.
See?
That was not planned.
That was not planned, but that was an action, and you reacted.
That kind of shook me.
Exactly. That was an action, and there's a reaction.
All right.
So that's a relationship formed in that moment where there was an action and a reaction, and all the relationships are action reaction.
Right. And so when we're thinking about relationships, we should be asking ourselves to see both. The action,
yes, we want to see the action and the reaction.
Turning a reaction into an action.
That's right.
And that kind of thing.
That's right.
Okay. That's great. And that would be great for like interpersonal dynamics too. Okay, so our final pattern is P for perspective.
P for perspective.
Which has two elements.
Two elements.
Which are
point and view. So what this is saying is that when we say a perspective, what we're really actually talking about is a relationship between the point or the looker and the view, the looked at, what the looker is seeing, right? And this looker doesn't always have to be like an actual looker with eyes. It could be a concept or something like that. So that's really important. And we could say the same thing about all four of these things that way, right? When we say distinction, what we're really talking about is a relationship between identity and other. When we say system, what we're really talking about is a relationship between part and whole. When we say relationship, what we're really talking about is a relationship between action and reaction. And when we say perspective, what we really mean is a relationship between point and view.
Yes, and what's interesting to me about perspective is I would say, I don't know what statistically, like 8 times out of 10, people think perspective is the point.
Yes.
My perspective.
My perspective.
I am the perspective. But really the perspective is me looking at you and what I see, and you looking at me. So I have a perspective, which is a relationship, my looking at you. And you have a perspective, which is you being the point on me as the view.
Yeah, so it's there's those two perspectives are actually 4 things.
Yes.
2 points and 2 views that are in a relationship. And believe it or not, what you just said is really important because it happens in 2 places very substantially. People mistake this pattern for this thing.
Yes.
And people actually mistake the distinction pattern for identity.
Yes.
So know that we are biased in that way. We tend to, when we say the word perspective, we are really just talking about the point.
Yes.
We're not talking about the relationship between the point and the view. And when we say the word distinction, we're often talking just about the identity, and we're kind of ironically ignoring the other.
Meaning we zero in on something and we don't see all the other stuff that it could be. Like
and we conflate distinction with identity, and we conflate perspective with point.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah.
Okay, so that gives us 4 patterns and 8 elements.
8 elements.
So we've done the 4 and we've done the 8. Now we're going to talk about the 3. The 3.
Well, here's the thing. Before we get into the 3,
sorry,
that's all right. This right here, you can learn this in just a few minutes like we've just done. And it's like a table. The table is this is equal to this, this is equal to this, this is equal to this, and this is equal to that. Right?
Yep.
So you should memorize that little table. Create that table on a piece of paper and write the word distinctions D, systems S, relationships R, perspectives P, and then identity little I, other little O, part little p, whole little w, action little a, reaction, little r. Point, little p with a dot or something to differentiate it from this little p. And view, little v, right? And then we can be more specific in our language when we talk about our thinking. This simple table not only gives you an understanding of your thinking, but it's going to give you a language to talk about your thinking. And that is really important.
So often when we're talking to people, I say to them, it's literally just asking yourself a couple of questions. So the question here is, what are the things I'm seeing and what am I not seeing, right? And the question here is like, does this thing have parts or is it part of something? Here, am I seeing the action and the reaction? And here is like, what's the point? What's the view? Can I change the point? Can I change the view? Which changes the perspective. So it's just using that structure to sort of ask yourself those questions, not only, so you just said we can language it. We can language our thinking, but we can also structure our thinking just by reminding ourselves to see those
Perfect.
right?
Yeah, and so sometimes we call those questions that you just spoke of thinquery because they're think query questions. But we can also map the moves, the 5 moves on this, right? So is not move, is not list is really focused on distinctions. It uses some part whole, but it's really focused on distinctions.
Yep.
Zoom in, zoom out. Zoom in, zoom out. That's all about part whole, going up into the whole, going down into the parts. Part party is about taking those parts that you found and relating them. RDS is about zooming into those relationships and making a zoom in of the relationship, right? So it's the relationship plus the zoom in to the parts. And P circle obviously is all about perspectives. So the 5 moves kind of map on DSRP. They're a little somewhat easier to learn in the beginning, but really the real power, because there's many, many more moves, there's thousands of moves. DSRP derives all those moves. So what we want you to do is practice the 5 moves, practice the thinquery. When you feel really good about that, then start getting into the 4, 8, and then we're going to talk about the 3 in a second. The 4-8-3 is where the real kind of slightly more advanced understanding of DSRP theory happens.
Yeah, and I almost think it's like this is sort of the engine behind it all.
Yeah.
All right, so speaking of that, so let's talk about the dynamics, the 3 dynamics, which should not be at all intimidating, but should be really quite interesting. And we've actually kind of hit on them in the explanation.
That's right. The 3 in the 4-8-3. So here's the 4, here's the 8. And the 3 is just the dynamics. So the dynamics is just a fancy science word for how do things interrelate.
Right. So let's take them one at a time.
Yeah. So the first one we've already talked about. It's the dynamic of equality. All it's saying is that when we talk about this thing, it equals these 2 things. And if we talk about these 2 things, it equals this thing. So D is equal to IO. That's why we call it equality.
Right.
S is equal to part whole.
Yep.
The interaction of part and whole. That's why we call it inequality. R is equal to action and reaction. And perspective, or P, is equal to the interaction between point and view.
Point and view.
Right?
Yep.
So we get the equality rule. Right?
Yep. That seems pretty simple.
Pretty simple in understanding it. A little bit harder to do, right? Because if we make the mistake of conflating perspective with point, or right where this guy's gone, or conflate identity with distinction, that's an example of not understanding the equality rule.
Right. And missing a lot of thinking.
Yeah, exactly. So because if you know that this thing equals these 2 things, then you would never say that this thing equals this thing.
No.
Right? In the same way that if I say 2 plus 3 equals 5, I would never say that 3 equals 5.
Right.
Right? That would be silly.
Right, but that's also a nice segue into the next dynamic, which is the co-implication dynamic.
Co-implication is simply that, imagine in between each of these elements is a two-way arrow. In between each of these little elements, right? These pairs, what we call the pairings, right? Imagine there's a little two-way arrow, two-way arrow, two-way arrow, two-way arrow. What co-implication means is that these guys are partners in crime. They co-implicate each other, right? So they're partners in creating the distinction. They're partners in creating the system. They're partners in creating the relationship, partners in creating the perspective.
Right.
What that means, and this is super, super important, is if you see one, the other has to be there.
Okay, let's slow that down. So if I see an identity, by implication, there is an other.
Yes.
If I see a part, by implication, there's a whole. Or if I see a whole, by implication, there's a part.
Yes.
If I see an other, by implication, there's an identity.
Yes.
So forth and so forth.
Yes.
Which means it's like a little tell for our thinking.
That's right.
Right?
It's a tell. It's a huge tell. And it's a hugely important tell. Because to be honest, a lot of folks are hiding those things for manipulative purposes, sometimes unbeknownst to them, just to manipulate themselves, to make them feel better or whatever. So when we know that if there's an identity, there's an other, and if there's an other, there's an identity. Always. It's never going to be true that that's not the case, right? So there's always going to be an identity if there's an other, and there's always going to be an other if there's an identity, and same with part whole, same with action reaction, same with point and view.
So what you just said is that sometimes people can use that as a manipulation, right? So when you were talking about that, are you saying, for example, we purposefully don't show the other for our own agenda, whatever it might be, like even in competition with a product, we purposefully, highlight ours and lowlight others. Or in relationships, I know one of the things is that all of advertising is trying to get you to make a relationship between something and a product, right?
Coke is life.
Or Happy Meals make you happy.
Happy Meals make you happy, right? They're trying to make you make an action-reaction relationship.
Between those.
Oftentimes without you knowing.
Right.
They're trying to get your brain to do this.
Right.
And it's quite easy to get your brain to do this.
Right. Which means if you remember both the equality and the implication, you won't be as susceptible to that manipulation. That's because you'll know that when somebody's making a relationship for you, you should question that. When somebody's focusing only on one identity or to ask those questions. Okay.
So the rule of equality, the dynamic of equality is simply that these things equal this, these things equal this, these things equal this, and these things equal this. The rule or the dynamic of co-implication is just that this thing co-implies this thing and vice versa. Same thing here, same thing here, same thing here.
So the last one.
The
big one.
Is, I would say, the most powerful, but also favorite. Kind of the most difficult to understand if you're new to this. So all we're going to do, we know that these things equal each other, and we know that these things co-imply each other. So let's just take the elements and let's put them in a circle, right? And imagine. So I mentioned the rule of equality is represented by the equal sign. The rule of co-implication is represented by the two-way arrow.
Yep.
And the rule of simultaneity, which just means something's happening simultaneously, is represented by the 8-sided asterisk.
Yes.
And the reason that it's an 8-sided asterisk is exactly because of this right here, which is if you take all these elements, if you take any one of these elements like identity, right? Anytime you have an identity, it could and likely is be acting in a different role as an other, a part, a whole, an action, a reaction, a point, and or a view.
Yep. That's right.
And anytime any of these things are acting, it could be any of the other 7 things.
Okay, so
simultaneously.
Yes.
So the way to think about this as a simple example is I'm right here, right now, Derek. But at the same time that I'm Derek, I'm a son, I'm a father, I'm a husband, I'm a professor, I'm a scientist, I'm a mountain guide, I'm a fun hog, I'm all these kinds of things, right? And that's all happening simultaneously. It's not like I'm divorced from being a dad while I'm sitting here. I'm a dad, right? So that's happening simultaneously. Well, the same thing is happening with these 8 elements. They're happening simultaneously. So we call it the rule of simultaneity, which is a hard word to say, but it just means simultaneous.
Yes. So let's do one or two more examples just to really make sure that this is understood, because it's important. So you just talked about how you can be a bunch of things all at once. Let's just take an example like, bear with me for a minute, dog. A dog is a dog is an identity, right? We can make the dog.
We could use Bruno.
So Bruno is a dog. His identity is that he's a dog.
His identity is that he's Bruno the dog.
Bruno the dog.
Yeah.
Which means he's not Kachi the dog.
Yeah, he's not Kachi the dog.
He's not a cat. He's not a duck. So he's an other.
So he's not Kachi.
Right.
Which is his other. Right. That's Bruno is Bruno. And he also is not Kachi. So notice that I said Bruno is Bruno. And Bruno is not Kachi. So he's simultaneously both those things.
So he's an identity and an other.
Yes.
Okay. He's also a whole. He's a whole dog, right?
He's got legs for parts.
He's got parts, so he's a part, and he's a part of our family.
Nose. He's got a really big nose.
Right. So he's simultaneously a part of our family and also a whole dog that has physical parts. So he's both a part and a whole.
Yeah.
So he's also an action and a reaction, right?
He's a force of nature. So he's definitely an action. And just bring food around and he'll be reacting to it.
Yes.
He'll have reactions, or he'll be a reaction to those things.
Right. Right. And he also has his own point. Like,
he definitely does.
You can imagine that, going through the world as Bruno, he has a point, and everything he sees, he's just scanning for food.
Yep.
Or affection. Yep. Food or affection.
Food or
that's
affection,
that's like his perspective, his point of view.
Yep.
Food. So what you're saying is that's true of any.
And he's also a view.
Sorry,
right?
he is a view.
So other points can look at him and see different things.
For example, we look at him and we love him.
And he's very fluffy and sweet. But if you saw him from the outside, you'd be like, oh, that's kind of a big, scary looking dog, and he has a big bark, and he's very protective.
Yes.
So, different people might see Bruno very differently. Yes. He represents a different view.
Yeah.
Right.
So Bruno is all of those things. He's an identity. He's an other. He's a part. He's a whole. He's an action. He's a reaction. He is a point, and he can be the view.
Yep.
So he is simultaneously all 8 elements at once, and that's true of anything that you think of.
It's true of all information in the universe.
Right.
Yeah, that's kind of a big.
It's kind of a big deal.
It's kind of a big thing. Yeah.
Okay.
So when we talk about 483, we're talking about the 4 patterns, D, S, R, and P, the 8 elements, right? Mm-hmm. The 3 rules. The 3 rules are the rule of equality, which is each one of these patterns has 2 elements, right? So the rule of equality looks like this.
Yep.
The rule of co-implication.
Yep. If there's one, there's another.
Yep. If there's one, there's another of the elements. And the rule of simultaneity, right?
Right.
Which is if one is acting, if a piece of information is acting in any one of these, it can and often is operating in all of them.
Yep. Just like Bruno.
Yep. And so we use a very simple shorthand for this, which is equal sign, double arrow, H-sided asterisk. And that represents the 3 dynamics of DSRP. And if you understand those, then you don't treat DSRP like buckets, because DSRP is definitely not buckets.
Right.
It is a very dynamical thing that your brain and the universe is doing.
That is the 483 method.
And I would really focus on the table. Commit the table to memory Not because memorization is a high form of learning, but because if you commit it to memory, then when you need it, it'll just be there for you. You won't have to struggle with, what's that word again? Just make some flashcards or make a table, hang out with a friend or a loved one or whatever, and test each other on it
And play with it.
and play with it.
Be playful with it.
Be playful with
And
it.
then you can master the method.